Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Love of Wisdom Book Club. This episode is recorded with Rebecca Mattis, and we speak about The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And this looks at some of the psychological basis for the differences in our views on politics and religion, and goes some way to explaining where some of the tensions and the polarization that we see today stems from. As always, I invite you to like and subscribe and share it. If anyone wants to come on and speak about a book with me, then drop me a message. And yeah, thanks for all your support, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. So, The Righteous Mind. What did you think of it? Because I think, was it you who recommended this book to me in the first place?
I don't remember if it was me or not. It might have been me.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably right. Well, I mean, I should probably say what the book is before I attack it, because I want to spend the whole time just kind of shredding it as much as I can. Like,
okay, that's yeah, that's fine. I haven't gone in for the overly critical thing. I've gone for the more, what does its findings mean and how do they impact me? So that'll give us two different angles to discuss it from, really. But I guess when you think of the book, what do you think of it being about? Because in my head, I've sort of divided it into three key ideas, I guess. Being intuition and rationality and how they relate to each other, and that sort of playing in with the development of morality. The second being the moral foundations theory and the different dimensions of morality, and the third being the role of religion and the differences between the left and the right wing, or conservatives and liberals, although he did throw libertarians in there towards the end. So I sort of, in my mind, the book is, those are the three big subjects of the book as I think of them. Is that similar to how you're conceptualizing it, or did you take it in a different way?
yeah, so let me again repeat what you said. You were talking about the moral intuitions versus moral rationalization.
Yeah.
And then the moral foundations matrices, which, you know, he's got that chart in the book, how he understands how morality is like clumped together in human evolution and cultural development, and then how that impacts the political divisions between the left and the right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that that's what he did, and I have problems with all of them, but for different reasons. So, my problem with the way he discussed moral intuitions versus moral rationalization, which he calls moral reasoning, and I object to that right off the bat. Because rationalization, post hoc rationalization, absolutely is a thing.
Yeah.
And it's something that we do pretty much all the time with probably every decision. And it's not just about moral decisions, it's about every decision. So if you're at an art show and you want to decide between two paintings and you can only afford to buy one, and you're like, which one should I pick? And you finally just choose one. And you choose one because of your intuition, your aesthetic intuition. You buy it, you take it home, and then you invent reasons why you chose that one. And that's been described, you know, that's just a facet of cognition. And that very example came out of a book I read like 12 years ago. Forget the book. But my point is that post hoc rationalization applies to everything, not just morality. And so when he talks about moral reasoning, he's talking about moral rationalization, which is different. So he describes moral reasoning as like the press secretary for your unconscious, right? It's just It's just that which is trying to justify your decisions. And yeah, that's a thing. I mean, I'm not discounting his statement. I mean, yes, that's how the human mind works about all kinds of decision making. But when I use my moral reasoning, I'm not doing post hoc justification. I'm trying to decide what to do and why. I'm not trying to justify previous decisions. I mean, if I have a big moral decision to make, I agonize over it. Yeah. And he doesn't talk about that at all.
Well, I think there's lots of different things to come back on there, really. So one of the things is that he actually addresses at one point some of the research relating to, I think it was in one of the earlier chapters where he was outlining this metaphor that he uses of the rider on the elephant, with the rider being controlled processes and the elephant being automatic processes. And he showed some of the research that said, you know, we make decisions about whether we like or dislike something almost instantaneously, and how I would call it, I tend to call it familiarity bias or exposure bias, but I can't remember what he called it now. But there was some research basically showing that the more they were, I believe, if I recall this properly, they were showing different words and measuring whether there was a positive or negative affect in response to these words. And it was basically showing that the more those words reoccur, the more positive the affect became. And it's sort of like, you know, the more familiar something is, the more positive you feel about it. So I do think, I mean, I actually, one of the things that I took from reading about this was, I've taken it into my practice with social work and some of my academic writing as well, to talk about how we make decisions, not necessarily moral decisions, but how we make decisions full stop, because it didn't make any sense to me, the idea that this would only apply to moral decision making, because effectively it's a description of the process of cognition full stop, you know. And I think this was in The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker as well. He wrote some bits about this, and I'm not going to be able to remember all the neuro biology that goes into it, but I remember that the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex is the bit responsible for rationalizing. I have a feeling it's the amygdala that's responsible for the emotional reasoning, and basically it showed that the amygdala, if that is the correct part that I'm referring to, replace that with the correct part if I've got the wrong part, anyone who's listening, that triggers in sort of fractions of a second in response to any stimulus, whereas the delay between that and the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex activating is quite significant. So the rationalization comes after the fact. And so while Haidt is definitely focused on morality in this, I think that's because it's a book about morality, and he's using a general principle of reasoning and then applying it to morality. So I'm trying to remember what the other thing you said I wanted to come back on was there. Oh, so the agonizing over moral decisions. I think that this is one of those cases where, I find this is something that I find quite a lot when I listen to content, like particularly when I listen to content online that's made by people who aren't accomplished academics, particularly content that would describe itself as red pill content. They tend to have access to a small, and you know, I probably fit into this category to some degree as well, because I'm not an accomplished academic. people have a limited knowledge of research, and the research in itself is accurate, but what the research tends to point to is an average proclivity amongst the population rather than a hard and fast rule of what everyone is like. And so what you get is, when you present these things as hard and fast rules, you get inevitably loads of exceptions to them, because an average doesn't account for the individual, it accounts for an average. And so I do think people often spend time considering and trying to rationalize, considering and questioning the appropriate course of action when faced with a moral decision, which is sort of what you're describing yourself doing. And I'm similar, but I actually, when I think about it, I'm like, I feel like I think about these things seriously, but I also quite often make the decisions in a short space of time. And I could ask myself the question, is that because I've spent most of my life being someone who wrestles with moral decisions and therefore have developed a number of heuristics to deal with those situations? Or am I just being biased and rationalizing my gut feeling? And even as someone who, I mean, I guess your 2 points sort of feed into each other in this regard, because as someone who tends to scrutinize their every decision and try and weigh them up, and I feel like I've trained myself to try and argue against whatever instinct I have all the time anyway. So I sort of have a contrarian inner voice. But although I might do that with bigger decisions, the smaller preferences that you were talking about, you know, which piece of art you like and things like that, I will still do in that post hoc rationalization way that Haidt's describing here. So it's no one is 100% one or the other, and people will still do post hoc rationalization for some things that they base on intuition, and some things they will agonize over and try and counteract their intuitive feelings on it. Does that sound?
Yeah, so you covered a lot of ground and you kept pinging things in my brain, and of course I'm not making notes, but so as to, I mean, I'm the kind of person who tends to think that I bought the wrong painting. And my house is full of paintings. I'm like, why did I buy that one? I should have bought the other one, right? So that's how I'm made already. Which is not to say I don't follow my moral intuitions, because I'm sure I do all the time. Yeah. I mean, I'm why should my brain be any different from anyone else? But what you were saying about how those books are written and how they're, you know, sort of talking about the general way people are, and then of course there's tons of people who don't fit that generality. Maybe that's why I like books that are focused on the outliers. For example, all kinds of books about neuroscience are focused on like stroke patients or people with really weird syndromes, and that's how they figure out how the brain works, is by interacting with people who, you know, whose visual cortex is damaged but their eyes are fine, and like they can actually see but they don't know that they can see, and if you throw something at them they'll catch it but they're like, well, that was just a lucky catch, I'm blind, you know, that kind of thing. Like, it's the outliers that tell me more. So when someone puts out a survey, a very biased, crappy survey, like the ones in this book, which I found to be just so bad, just like embarrassingly bad from my point of view, and I could get into why, but I guess I don't need to. It's like, well, what is he really telling me? I mean, if he's using these kinds of survey questions, which are so mushy, and yeah, he comes out with information and it's different on this side than on that side, but what is it actually telling us? I think it just seems too mushy to me. And then as to your comment about whether you have just tricked yourself into thinking that you're applying rationality to your gut decisions, and you've built a heuristic or whatever you called it. Not quite sure what that word means, but anyway, you built like a scaffold.
Shortcuts. Mental
What?
shortcuts is
Okay.
the easiest
All
way
right.
to describe it.
Yeah, cool. Okay, good. It doesn't, like, that part doesn't matter to me so much, because what I'm interested in is how the writer teaches the elephant. And the writer does teach the elephant. That's what development is. That's what maturation is learning from your experiences. So once upon a time, I would have made very different decisions than I make now. And they were gut decisions. And I've taught my gut to react in certain ways. I've taught my gut to raise a red flag. For example, I've taught my gut to raise a red flag every time I tell a lie.
Yeah.
That lie can be one of these stupid post hoc rationalization explanations, right? And it's just, and I'm in the moment and I'm just trying to say things, and I say something and that freaking flag goes up, and then I'm like, oops, I lied. And I'll say that out loud. Oh, I lied, and I'm like, that was wrong. What I meant to say was this. And that just happened like in a meeting last week. And the other people at the meeting said, well, that wasn't a lie. You just made a mistake. And I'm like, no, I'm holding my subconscious to the highest standard. I don't want my subconscious to lie to me, So anyway, but fair enough, okay, so this book is talking about sort of the general picture, but talking so much about the general picture, I think he might miss what's most important. And just concentrating on post hoc rationalization, he's ignoring the development of morality within individuals. And he really is just talking about virtue signaling. Throughout the whole book, he equivocates accountability and virtue signaling. He's just saying that making an account of yourself is just for the purpose of maintaining your status, rather than for the purpose of supporting your own integrity and truth-telling.
Well, so that's an interesting point, because there was I guess that sort of depends on what you see morality as. It is, because that sounds like you're sort of making a claim to a deontological sort of morality, where it's you accountable to these universal rules, rather than more a sort of developed set of social norms that fill an evolutionary function. Because the claim, as I understand it, that he's making in this book is that there are basic evolutionary functions that prime us to develop certain moral matrices, and he is trying to. So I do have some. I share some of your concerns about how the different dimensions have been formed, because he's labeled 6 different dimensions of morality, hasn't he? In the end, was care/harm, fairness/cheating, loyalty/betrayal, authority/subversion, sanctity/degradation, and liberty/oppression. So those are the 6 dimensions along which his moral foundations theory says that morality is based. I have to confess, I haven't looked at the actual research papers for that one to see exactly how it's formed, because to me there's 2 different angles that you can come to defining defining dimensions on a matrix like that. And I think of, like, you know, the Big Five personality test and how that first came about, that they decided there was 5 dimensions, but what they basically did was create a collection of statements and linguistic measurements that they felt would reflect personality, and then see where they cluster and see what those clusters represent. So effectively, you've got a sort of brute force empiricism there, where they're like, we're just going to measure and measure and measure and measure, see what we found out, and then see what it indicates after that. Whereas this sounds like it's done. My initial reading of this is that he's sort of come up, we've done some observations that aren't necessarily empirical, and then has gone, well, these sort of moral behaviors and attitudes seem to represent something along these lines, or something along these lines. And he did, as he because he started off with 5 of them, didn't he? He didn't originally have the liberty oppression one, and then as he was doing the research, he basically said there's something not quite right, it's not all fitting in together, and he changed fairness and cheating to, because it was too heavily focused on the left-wing version of fairness, which is that everyone gets equal treatment, versus the right-wing version of fairness, which is that the process is proportional. And then he added in the liberty oppression because there was an area of people's morality that wasn't being measured. So it's sort of like a hybrid between that, starting with the foundations and then measuring, and starting with the measurements and then extracting the foundations. But I haven't read the research papers to look at that exact process. And so I think there's always a risk, if you start with the dimensions first, that you might be then sort of adjusting measurements to fit into your hypothesis, rather than creating a hypothesis from the measurements.
Well, to be fair to Haidt, you know, I think that he started out with a hypothesis, and and so you have to, and then he goes out and does all kinds of measurements, and then he gets some surprises, and he does talk about in the book, where he questions, were my results did the numbers I get, were they the result of a biased survey? I mean, he does ask that question out loud at least once in the book, and so he adjusts his surveys to account for feedback that he got, in this case from conservatives who were complaining that he said that they, weren't, that they didn't believe in fairness or whatever. And they're like, yes, we do, but it's just proportionality. So he does, he is, I think he's using his surveys responsibly. But you were talking about deontological morality versus the kind of moral matrix built upon just a lot of testing or just built upon evolutionary psychology or whatever, like finding out what's in our brains one way or another, rather than the sort of overarching morality that exists somehow. Like that was what you were saying at the very first, right?
Yeah, before I got distracted.
Yeah. So no, I don't believe that there's a morality that exists. I believe that morality is evolutionarily constructed, for sure. And I have developed my morality through my interactions with the people around me. And I care about the things because it's in me to care about them, right? Absolutely. My moral intuitions are no different from any other human. And they're put there by evolution. So I believe that. But when I make an account of myself, I'm accountable to my own sense of integrity.
Yeah.
And rather than just trying to look good. And I think like that's a huge, it's like this rift in the book for me. And especially now, because the book was written in 2012, right? And
I think so.
the world has just changed so much. I mean, he's talking about the left and the right in 2012. Yeah, 2012. It's 10 years old. He's talking about the left and the right. And it's like those no longer exist. Like the left that he was talking about in 2012 is gone. It exists in this tiny, tiny, it's just a fraction, right? The left is now the woke, which is just utterly, utterly different from what he has here. I mean, I think the people within it are the same. I don't know. That might be a whole separate conversation, and I don't want to lose sight of what I was talking about with being accountable to the self. But I don't know. I just lost my train.
No, it's all right. So what you said was enough to prompt me back on track from my original tangent, which is what I was basically saying is there's several bits of research that do show that people are more likely to behave in a way that is considered moral when there's greater levels of accountability. And that's, you see that with all those different games where it's like some people are tasked with, if you contribute to this, then it's doubled and divided equally between everyone. And the most advantageous thing for everyone is for everyone to put their chips in. The most advantageous thing for an individual is to put nothing in. And people will put nothing in far more often when it's anonymous. And then when everyone can see it, everyone tends to get a lot more equal contributing. And there's even been stuff that's shown that people will play more fairly in a game when there's a picture of an eye on the wall to create the feeling of being watched, even though it doesn't actually create any higher level of accountability. And so I think I would make a distinction between that and virtue signaling to some degree, because to me, virtue signaling involves a deliberate display of superficial or pretentious virtuosity that is insincere in some way, whereas that might be insincere, but I don't think it's a deliberate display of virtuosity. It's more a adherence to a social norm or to social policing. So it's not, you don't get points for not being bad, and that's more about not appearing bad than it is about appearing good. And I think that if you look at the foundations, the evolutionary explanations for how lots of these foundations that he's suggesting developed, and the explanations he's suggesting for them, like fairness and cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, liberty, oppression, the others are probably less relevant in this particular example, but those 4 dimensions evolve as part of a cooperative enterprise of society and are about enabling us to police each other's behavior. So if you take the fairness/cheating dimension, for example, once we have shared intention and we begin to engage in trade and mutual sort of endeavors that require participation, then you instantly run into the free rider problem, right? Of like, someone could benefit from not contributing to the same degree. And so we develop a moral emotion to be offended by people doing that, so that we defend ourselves against the problem of everyone's continued efforts being exploited by a free rider. And so as we become offended by cheating, you can't have something without its opposite. So you then get a positive affect towards the concept of fairness. And so assuming people exist on a spectrum, which I think is a fairly safe assumption to make, it may be that for most people, particularly people who are conscientious and therefore feel very strongly about the need for certain moral behaviors, they will police themselves and ensure they adhere to this in the way you're describing you doing with yourself. It's about your integrity and you knowing you're behaving in a moral way. But people who are low in conscientiousness tend to not be so concerned with that. And obviously, you have psychopaths being the notable exception, where they don't have an emotional part of the reasoning. They're completely rational, but they don't have the emotional and affective levels of this moral process. And so their only accountability to themselves is, well, does it benefit me? Does it feel good? They lack that. Is it the right thing to do in a broader moral sense? So I think that you're right to say that there is a distinction between holding yourself to account and doing it for the sake of avoiding being highlighted as a cheater or possessing some other negative moral value. I would disagree with equating that with virtue signaling, and I would agree, and I would say that it depends on that individual person and is most likely linked to conscientiousness.
I agree with what you're saying, but I have a different definition of virtue signaling than you do. So that's important and should be discussed.
Yeah.
You define virtue signaling with the definition of hypocrisy, and so right on, like that's how you define virtue signaling, as just straight hypocrisy. But I'm defining virtue signaling slightly differently. And for me, and I guess I'm being kind of political, I'm definitely getting into politics at this point, especially since this is a book about politics. But my definition of virtue signaling includes hypocrisy, but it also includes doing something for show without attending to its consequences. So, for example, for me, a great example of virtue signaling in public policy action is affirmative action. Oh, let's do this thing that sounds virtuous. And it just hurts. It just hurts everybody, and especially hurts the people that it's purporting to help. And this has been going on for 50 years, and it's bad, and it's demonstrably bad. And you're not even allowed to talk about it or go there, and you're shut down if you say, hey, this is hurting people, this is actually harming people. You are squashed, because the important thing is to fit into the group. And so I guess this is where I come down to my big political statement here, which is the left, the modern day left, or the far left, or whatever you want to call it, the woke left, doesn't actually care about harm. It talks incessantly about harm, but it could not care less about harm, because it doesn't want to know when people are being harmed. It only wants to talk about harm. So it has completely, as a blob, I'm not saying as a group of individuals, but as a social blob, if it's a slime mold, the slime mold of the woke left has utterly divorced its moral rationalization from any moral matrix. And it talks about these things, and it does the opposite.
So I think this is where the elephant and the rider situation comes in, because I've been thinking this for ages. I was thinking this this probably won't have come across your radar because it's UK politics, but our government held they said it wasn't a budget, but I'm just calling it I can't believe it's not a budget, because it was a budget. They were calling it a fiscal event, but where they basically outlined some plans, and those are perfectly up for debating, their benefits and consequences. But what I was noticing from the immediate reaction on my social media was that people were only reacting to the first order consequences. And the first order consequences like, oh, we've decreased we're not increasing the level of tax on corporations, and people are like, that just means corporations get to make more money. And what they don't see is the second order consequences, where that means that businesses are more free to operate, which means that investors will invest more, which means that more jobs are created, which means that people end up better off. And so you have like these stages of consequence to everything. And I think that I think that there's that hypocrisy, yes, hypocrisy is present in virtue signaling, but I think it's also present in the non-virtue signaling behaviors that I was describing earlier. I think to me the difference is it's virtue signaling when it's trying to give the appearance of a positive rather than trying to give the appearance of an absence of a negative. That was the distinction that I was making. And I think that what you get is you get an intuitive care, harm, concern, where people on the far left or the woke left, whichever you want to call it, they feel that intuitively that something should be beneficial. They're like, so let's keep on using the affirmative action example. Their instinctive feeling will be, they might have some data available that says, black people or ethnic minorities are getting accepted to prestigious universities at a lower rate and have a lower level of educational attainment in that, and they will think to themselves instinctively, well, that's not fair. That's they should get as much opportunity as anyone else, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be achieving to that level. Then they jump to the conclusion that it's a result of discrimination. But they're not. Then they go, okay, well, how could we fix that? I know, let's make it so that these universities have to take on more ethnic minorities. It feels kind of clunky using ethnic minorities as a all-encompassing sort of group for everyone who's not white in the US or the UK, particularly because once you start to look at the data, there's a massive discrepancy in them. But they're going with just that first order consequence and that intuitive feeling of there is something that is harming people's prospects, that feels unfair, therefore we need to address it. And my instinctive feeling is that if we just push more people into these situations, then it'll be better. And then what you get when you look at the data is that people are being put into prestigious universities without sufficient grades because they have to hit a quota. And rather than those people being just as capable and in that environment and able to succeed despite their lower grades, actually they are mismatched with their universities and they tend to drop out quicker because they've gone from being maybe the smartest kid in their school to being the least smart kid in this university. And so the dropout rates get higher, the educational attainment gets lower, and you tend to increase tension and discrimination by emphasizing that, because everyone's going to be questioning all your achievements, going, well, did you just get that because of your ethnicity? And so there's all these second and third order consequences to that, which are negative, but those are, because they're second and third order, they're in the realm of the rider and not the elephant. And so I think I do think that there is a moral foundation to these decisions. It's just an intuitive moral foundation to them rather than a rational moral foundation to them, because in the long term it actually undermines the intuitive moral motivations for it.
Right. So that was very elucidating. And it sort of just brought up a question for me, sort of, is how do we apply the contents of this book, The Righteous Mind, to the problem of people who instinctively promote affirmative action? Let's just be very specific, right? So you just began to do that. You're saying, well, they're promoting affirmative action because of this instinct that it looks like it'll help, and then they're never using their rational mind to communicate back to the elephant. So here's where the book falls short for me, is in this question, is how do we use our rational minds to train the elephant? So Haidt goes a little way down this road. He wants to build institutions. He wants to build institutions in which people are arguing with each other all the time. That's his dream. He's like, okay, everyone just have your intuitions, but let's argue about stuff, right? And it's like, okay, right on. Yeah, let's do that. And if his dream could come true, then we would all be a lot better off, for sure. Because right now we're not allowed to argue, which is a disaster.
I think we should substitute argue for debate here, because there's plenty of arguing going on. It's just not beneficial.
Oh, I use the words interchangeably. Debate.
Yeah, so do I often, but when you're using the word argue repeatedly, when you say get everyone in a room together and make them argue, just sounds like, football hooligans.
All right,
is the image that springs to mind.
I will attempt to use the word discussion and debate and discourse instead of argue, because
you can use argue. I just wanted to make that clarification that I was
okay. When I say argue, I mean debate, discussion, and discourse. But I'll try to use those words because other people also have this idea of argument, and I need to communicate in a way that other people can understand. So he wants a lot of discourse, and and he's working on that. Heterodox Academy and University of Austin. Like he's trying to build these, and support these institutions. That's where he is at. The other thing he says, though, which is weird, and I'm not sure how important this is, and maybe I'll just leave it out, but now that I've mentioned it, I have to say it, is that he says, where is it? Sorry, I have it written down in my notes.
That's all right.
He wants to, he is celebrating the moral. He is celebrating the human tendency to constantly police other people's morality. And he's saying that is good because it builds moral societies. And so he thinks that, oh, damn it, where is it? Okay, so he thinks that this is a great thing because he views people, he's starting to view people as merely, he's only viewing moral reasoning as the press secretary for the moral intuitions. He does not at all discuss what you were referring to as second, third, and fourth order reasoning, which is interacting with the facts of the world and applying them to our moral intuitions. He doesn't talk about that at all. He just is assuming that everybody is always just rationalizing themselves to other people rather than truly making an account of themselves. So he goes, it could well be that for evolution to design an ethical society, reputation would have to be paramount within each individual brain. Okay, I agree with that. Reputation is important, and I think integrity is just an internalized sense of reputation, right? So
Yeah.
so that thing about the eye painted on the wall, I've painted that eye within my own mind. It's there, like on the inside of my skull, watching my brain. So he goes, otherwise there would be too many sociopaths. Absolutely. However, within that actual ethical society, truth. Oh no, this is not him. This is me talking. God damn it. I'm reading my own quotes. No wonder I agree with them. This is what he says. Reason is not fit to rule. And he uses reason to mean post hoc rationalization.
Yeah.
Okay? It was designed to seek justification, not truth. I'll show that Glaucon was right, this old philosopher guy. People care a great deal more about appearance and reputation than about reality. Well, we see that that's true.
Yeah.
And that's what I call virtue signaling. When you care about appearance and reputation more than about reality, you're not attending to the second, third, and fourth order things, okay?
My brain was desperately looking for the name Glaucon when we were talking about it earlier, and I couldn't get it. It was in there somewhere and I couldn't dig it out. So I'm really glad that you've read that out.
So he says, I'll praise Glaucon for the rest of the book as the guy who got it right, the guy who realized that the most important principle for designing an ethical society is to make sure that everyone's reputation is on the line all the time, so that bad behavior will always bring bad consequences. Right?
That is a dangerous statement, because that is effectively the justification for cancel culture.
Exactly. It is a social media nightmare. This is not normal society. And we can prove to Jonathan Haidt that this line of his, so innocently written in 2012, that everyone's reputation is on the line all the time. No, that isn't true. Everyone's reputation is not all on the line all the time in normal life. It is on social media, which is why we're in this horrible mess that we're in. But actually, there's a lot of give and take with reputation, and person to person. There's all kinds of forgiveness, and there's all kinds of what's the word? You're working out with people, what the moral is, and there's give and take, and there's negotiation. You're negotiating stuff. And, it's not enough to build institutions that are just big brothers watching you as to morality. You have to build institutions in which this social negotiation is very, very healthy. And again, he doesn't talk about that at all, because he never talks about how actual reasoning, not post hoc rationalization, but reasoning, which are in charge of those higher order consequences of policy, how that reasoning can instruct our moral intuitions. He never talks about that.
Yeah, and I think this is, I've been thinking about this recently for a variety of reasons, mostly to do with politics, because I've been reading a fair bit of Thomas Sowell over the last year or so. I'm probably 5 or 6 of his books in the last year. And one of the things that he often talks about is the government being its own institution with its own incentives and constraints, just like any other, and how it responds to those. And one of the remarkable things I saw about yesterday's budget was that it was the first time I've seen a government do something based on what they believe is right rather than what they believe will win votes. Because some of the decisions that were made within that budget are going to, well, that all of the decisions made within that budget, with possibly the exception of the decrease in the lowest rates of tax, are going to be unpopular with the left, and a significant amount of it will be unpopular with even some of the people on in the centre for the Conservative Party. So it wasn't a popular decision. And one of the things I've been thinking of is like, okay, there's the incentives for politics are to win. The goal is to win elections. They want to continuously be elected. The easiest way to win elections is with popular policies, regardless of their impact in the long term, that can at least win votes in the 4-year cycle that elections run on. And 4 years is very short term for any economic policy to have any significant impact, particularly when you're talking about freeing up the market to allow investment. You could implement a load of policies on day one in office and then not going to have reached their potential. I mean, one of the things they're not going to reach their potential within the 4-year cycle. One of the things that's been very apparent is that, our Prime Minister, now I'm trying to think. So we had David Cameron, then we had Theresa May, then we had Boris Johnson, then we had Liz Truss. I hope I haven't missed anyone there. So Theresa May, so 2 prime ministers ago, Theresa May implemented a price cap on energy, so the energy companies couldn't charge above a certain price. That policy was, I don't remember its popularity at the time, but I'm going to guess it was probably popular because it appeals to people going, yeah, we don't want to pay above a certain amount in energy, so that's totally right, and the energy companies should absorb that. It took years after she was out of office for the impact of that to truly come into play, when the price of energy shot up, and because of this price cap, loads of the smaller energy firms went out of business because they could no longer make a profit to make their business sustainable. And then the next consequence of that was that all of the customers got divvied out by an independent regulator between the big energy firms who were still in trading. And another consequence of that is that they had a massive influx of customers all of a sudden, so they had to hire more staff, they had to pay more administrative costs, and so the non-energy side of the costs of bills shot up massively because they had to distribute that cost between their customers. There will be some people who want to argue with what I've just said based on the fact the profit margins that energy companies work on and so on and so forth. But this is basically a vague outline of what's happened, and that debate is separate. Policies. So that policy could well have been popular, but it's had disastrous consequences because another thing that stopped the costs from going down is that there's now less competition in the market because loads of companies have gone bust. So that's a classic case of a policy being made because it's popular, it'll win votes, and the consequences won't be reaped by the politician who's in office. So I was thinking, how do we change the way that works? And one of my ideas is changing election cycles to 6 years rather than 4. And the reason that I think 6 years, because I think anything more than 6 years and you get into dangerous territory, because you need the continuous democratic process to live in a democratic society. And you don't want to get into the Vladimir Putin realm of just changing the rules constantly so you stay in power, or the Xi Jinping or any of the others throughout history who continuously change the rules to remain in power for as long as they want. So I think 6 years is a more reasonable time for politicians to be expected to more frequently deal with the consequences of decisions they make. So then you're decreasing the incentive for short-term decision making. And the other thing I think is that if we were to teach economics as a standard part of the curriculum in school, and the reason I chose economics was because many of its principles are actually quite simple to understand. Definitely at the secondary school level, you know, there are things in there that are more important and more practical for understanding the world than, say, geography. It's the lesson that most immediately springs to mind, where I'm like, yeah, it was interesting and it might help some people on a career to become geographers, but really it hasn't helped me that much. You know, I might understand slightly better how rain happens, but it doesn't change the fact that it's raining or not raining. I'm going to apologize in advance to any geographers watching this. If you're angry at me, you can share your thoughts in the comments. But economics operates on assessing things by the different orders of consequences. So you're teaching people critical thinking by default, because they're not just going, oh, less tax on a corporation means corporations make more money. They're going, okay, but what happens after that? And what happens after that? And what happens after that? And I think that teaching people those critical thinking skills will benefit them massively in other areas of their life. Economics in itself benefits you in your life because it teaches you how to allocate resources in your life, so you know how to ensure the best quality of life and how to make decisions weighing up the costs and benefits. And it also enables better understanding of what it is we're actually voting on when it comes to political matters, because I'm not going to say 90%, a huge portion of what politics is about is deciding exactly how the government should interfere with the economy. And what policies they're going to put in place to either stimulate or impact on the economy in some way. So that is these are two big society-wide ideas that I've had for how we could improve the use of the rider rather than the elephant for policy making decisions.
Good luck with that.
Oh yeah. I'm not saying they're likely to happen, but you know, I like to play with the ideas and.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think those are good ideas, but again, I mean, especially with the teaching economics, that's not likely to happen anytime soon. Not while teachers are busy teaching about other things. Let's just say. But so my question now is, I want to get back to this idea about I want to refine your idea about the idea you just said about
okay.
the 6-year term limit and teaching economics. How do we get reasoning, true reasoning? How do we get rationality communicated to all of these elephants? And so Jonathan Haidt was, and also to bring it back to the book, he was talking about how different political parties communicate using different, damn it, what's the word, that rhetoric. They use different rhetorical tools to communicate with people's elephants. And he said in 2012 that the right uses a greater variety of rhetorical tools than does the left. Of course, now we have the problem of the rhetorical tools completely being mismatched to the actual moral matters. So it's just, the whole thing is crazy. So how do we how do we make use of this idea of the moral intuitions to communicate rationally, other than institute, like, so this is what I've been doing.
Yeah.
You know, I tried to communicate rationally when I was a elected official. Of course, that didn't work, right? I lost my seat because I should have been virtue signaling, and I wouldn't. So
Yeah.
lost my place. But I do have groups in which I'm still a viable member. And so I'm trying to promote rationality within those groups. Since I can't wave a magic wand and say, all right, let's teach economics to every public school student, you know,
Yeah.
what can I do in this nightmarish context? And I think it comes down to, it just comes down to using emotional words and using value-laden content to get past people's rhetorical prejudices. And it just comes down to very careful communication, because while I've been trying to, you know, tear the book apart, and I have 18 pages of notes that are doing that, the fact remains.
You're my most prepared guest ever by a long way.
Well, I barely got to refer to them, actually. Oh well. And then part of the time I read a quote of mine and attributed it to him. Oops. But I cannot disagree about this thing about moral intuitions and moral rationalization. I mean, he's clearly correct. I have no arguments against that. That is, I believe, true. And so how do we use that truth to encourage people to actually enter these second, third, and fourth orders of thinking, actually use rationality to interact with their moral intuitions, their elephants? And I think it comes down to using values-laden language.
Well, I think you read Nonviolent Communication. I haven't actually read it, but some of the principles of that come to my mind immediately, you know. And it can be quite a frustrating process because you always spend your time feeling like you have the burden for making the conversation go in a healthy, productive direction, and you don't necessarily have it. You have to deal with a lot of time where you don't have buy-in from the other party. But basically, you know, I feel like I've been getting better at this over time, of talking with people who maybe are more sympathetic or more who appreciate or tend to adhere more to the woke ideology or the far left ideology or critical social justice ideology, whichever one you want to call it, who are more sympathetic or sort of adjacent to that, who will hear these ideas and go, oh yeah, that sounds like a nice idea, you know, the intuitive, you know, they're primed to their effective priming towards the idea, go, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I support ethnic minorities, I support gay people, I support, you know, this and that minority, so I am instantly positively predisposed towards the ideas that I'm being told. And I spend quite a lot of time interacting with them, particularly because I used to be one of them to a significant degree. You know, I used to be amongst the far left activists, and I only came out of that because I realized that what I was what I was pursuing was being sabotaged by the methods and goals that I was actually using. So, you know, what I fundamentally believe in when I strip it back to its absolute minimum is, you know, basically that basically goes straight into moral foundations theory. You know, I feel like we should be trying to reduce harm. We should care for people. We should increase fairness. You know, I think I probably care more about loyalty than many people do at that end of the spectrum, because yeah, and maybe more about sanctity as well, and you know, liberty rather than oppression. So, like, all these sort of moral matrices, I find, although they're probably imperfect and sort of clunky, they sort of also line up to some degree with what my foundational principles are. And then I was like, well, I was going along with the elephant all the time and being like, these sound like good ideas that are hypothetically in support of my values, so why not go with them? And then I was like, well, actually, I'm seeing evidence now that they're counterproductive and that there are other ways of achieving these things that are more effective. And I try and I basically changed my mind on a lot of it, and now I try and follow the evidence to the best that I can. And I try and be open to changing my mind, but I still have lots of contact with that sort of community, despite there being a little bit of hostility directed towards anyone who expresses a different opinion in those circles. And I have to pick and choose when it's safe for me to express my opinion, given that it doesn't necessarily it isn't necessarily cohesive with everyone else's. But I try and adopt that non-violent communication model where I go, okay, there's something in this, you know, there is a moral foundation beneath this where we share the same concern. And if we go back to affirmative action, the example, you know, my issue with affirmative action is that it's unfair and it's causing harm. The argument in favor of affirmative action is they want to address unfairness and they want to address harm. So if you can communicate to someone in a way that says, this is sabotaging the goal, here's an alternative that I think will be more positive, you know, whether it's implementing charter schools, whether it's changes to the curriculum, whether it's you know, using certain resources that are better evidence to increase positive outcomes, whether it's going, look, I'm concerned we're getting the problem confused, because I don't know about in the US, but in the UK, there was some research done into institutional racism, and they basically found that while Black Caribbean pupils tended to achieve far less than white British pupils, actually Black African students were achieving more than white British pupils. So the issue, there was something unique to it that wasn't based on skin color. You know, it wasn't, and so it's how working to find that common moral or value based desire, wish, or whatever, motivation is the word I'm looking for, that common value-based motivation that underlies the 2 points of action, and using that to bridge the gap. And that's probably where I think this book is most useful in that regard, because so one of the things that I experience a lot, I know a lot of people who just hate all conservatives, without ever actually speaking to them or dealing with their ideas. They haven't given consideration to them. Again, it's that intuitive first order thinking that I was speaking about earlier. They're lowering corporation tax. That means they just want rich people to get rich. It's not helping the poor. Conservatives are evil and they must all be rich and want to help themselves, which this book addresses several of those arguments at different points. And so it's helping people to understand the perspectives of the other side and to realize that there is a moral reasoning behind it. There is a moral motivation, and even just that understanding that the two different concepts of fairness, one being equality and one being proportionality, without that understanding, both sides just see the other one as unfair and therefore immoral. And so that's sort of what I see one of the big values of this book is like helping people to understand the moral matrix of their, I don't want to say opponents, they're ideological opposites, I guess is probably the best way of saying it.
I would prefer to see a book that demonstrated that these moral matrices are thoroughly employed by every person and how. I disagree with part of what this book is saying about how the moral matrices are used in political rhetoric. On the one hand, yes, the left appears to talk about care harm and liberty/oppression, although in the current left, the opposite of oppression is not liberty at all. Like they don't care about liberty. They only care about oppression. It's weird. Like the opposite of oppression is power.
The opposite of oppression is retributional oppression, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So there's that. So there's that problem. But let's put that problem aside. But I would like to see research done, and he hints at it at the book without ever developing it. He shows how, for example, people on the left are very concerned about things like sanctity and purity and even loyalty. And they're just not, they have those intuitions. They just don't necessarily talk about it that way. So I'm looking in my notes. And the reason why I want to do this is because what I think is important is for people to understand that moral foundations are universal. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Jonathan Haidt is making this claim, this sort of evolutionary psychology oriented claim, that he is trying to elucidate universal human moral foundations. And so if that's true, and I believe it is, although I don't agree with his matrix exactly, I have a lot of problems with it, but never mind that. I still think that morals and values are universally human because they're placed here by evolution. So they are. But he never talks about just how the left is concerned with purity. How is the left concerned with sanctity? How is the left concerned with loyalty? And if he did that, how is the left concerned with proportionality? If he did that, then that would be the beginning of having conversations about how people use different rhetoric around these universal moral foundations, either different political strategies or just different key words. And the problem that I'm having today is that people have these keyword prejudices that are they're just thought stoppers. And so you're not able to communicate with anyone's elephant because they immediately kick you off the minute you say some word or other. Like you're done.
Yeah.
and it's so you know that book, The Elephant Whisperer?
I don't know it, no, but
Well, it's a book of, well, you know, The Horse Whisperer.
yeah.
Okay, so the horse whisperer, he can, you know, tame any horse. Well, the elephant whisperer is written by this guy who tames elephants, or he works with elephants, and he's an elephant whisperer, right? So I think we all need to learn how to be elephant whisperers for each other's moral intuitions. But I think a great start would be to maybe kind of throw out half of what his book is saying, and in that oh, the left has this limited number and the right has this more maximum number, and say no, how is the left using the full moral matrix? How do they communicate it, and what are the key words that we can use to whisper to those elephants? I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, so what you're sort of what you're talking about is basically that you feel while he alludes to, so I believe that he put his research showed that care harm, fairness cheating, and liberty oppression are the biggest moral dimensions on which the left tend to focus. Like when you ask a series of questions being like, you know, how much do you value this? Those are the ones that get highlighted, whereas loyalty betrayal, authority subversion, and sanctity degradation, they don't tend to rely on as much. Whereas when the results for people who define themselves as conservative will use all 6 dimensions roughly equally, which means they use care harm, fairness cheating, and liberty oppression less than the left do, but they use the other 3 more. So you sort of get an average amount of moral thinking. It's just how distributed it is across the thing, roughly. And so what you're talking about is, where are the situations where those 3 dimensions that are getting used less by the left are actually coming into play? So like, for example, the sanctity degradation one very clearly comes into play with the left and environmentalism, right? They view nature as pure and in need of saving, and they're concerned about pollution and recycling and so on, and that's a sanctity degradation dimension of morality. But and that clearly, I don't remember environmentalism coming up, because I took the test on his website, and I think I came out as libertarian, which wasn't that surprising. But I don't remember it very well, but I don't remember that much coming up about the environment. And I wonder if you did include more environmental stuff, if that dimension might shoot up for the left quite a bit more. But he also mentions that in the book, because he does say that the left do value this, because he doesn't say they disregard these, it's just that they put less weight on them. But what you're sort of saying is it would be useful for practically understanding how we appeal to that morality, and how we can, I mean, effectively you're getting into the realm of politics, and to some degree you could be getting into the realms of manipulation and you know, the sort of how to win friends and influence people side of things, where you're going, you know, what words and what concepts can I use that will appeal to someone's someone's moral intuitions, so as to gain favor with them, to enable a more productive conversation about how we can move forward and improve things. Is that a fair summary? I went off on a tangent in the middle there, but I think, is that a fair summary of what you were saying? Or
Well, I don't know what I'm saying because I have a continual, whatever, whichever one it is. I have a constant problem that has been
Yeah.
ongoing for the past, 7 years,
Yeah.
which is how to get people to stop promoting harmful policies, right? In the name of their own virtue. And I keep coming back. Every time I have this conversation, it's the same conversation. I keep coming back to face-to-face conversation with individuals.
Yeah.
I have never yet found a way of social media scale or political scale communication that would engage with anyone's elephant, that would do anything other than bring up their thought stoppers and their rhetorical prejudices, and just you would get kicked off. And so I'm not trying to say how you just summarized it. I'm not really. I dream of a political solution. But I don't know that there is one. I think it's individual, and I think it's institutional. And when I talk about institutional, I'm talking about the local institutions, the groups of which individuals are a part. I'm talking about local groups of individuals within institutions. And so I guess the fact that he said that left-wingers only talk about 3 of the moral matrices, I think that's wrong. I think that's a result of bias in the test, because he never asked those questions that would elucidate responses from left-wingers. When he talked about duty, it was all about duties that right-wingers would be likely to talk about. He never said we have a duty to dismantle white supremacy. And of course,
which matrix would you say the duty comes on? Because I'm thinking like the authority subversion one, and I'm wondering is how you perceive authority subversion dimension of morality manifesting itself on the left.
Well, I mean, the modern day left is incredibly authoritarian, and I wonder actually if this book wouldn't be better spend its time, instead of left versus right, but authoritarian versus libertarian. Actually, that would be an interesting book to read, or pamphlet at any rate. I mean, the left has traditionally had a subversive rhetoric.
Yeah.
But I mean, we see left-wing authoritarianism throughout the 20th century, and we sure as hell see it now. There's nothing subversive about the modern day left, other than they want to, quote, subvert, they want to destroy institutions. So that's subversive, yeah. But, if you take left-wing rhetoric about, say, COVID policy, it's all about following the experts, right? Follow the science, follow the experts, follow the science. That's very authoritarian. That's, and I'm not saying it's wrong or bad necessarily. I'm just saying that is the rhetoric that I'm hearing. It is our duty to follow the science and to follow the experts on this policy.
Yeah. So I feel like to some degree the way you're describing the structure of the modern left is not, and perhaps this is different in the US, but I feel like there is still, despite how it may appear at times, there is still a significant portion of the left that are moderate and reasonable and rational people. It's just that the furthest and most authoritarian reaches of the left are very vocal and very good at having a large impact with a small amount of people. Predominantly because most people are fairly conflict averse, and if you have some very authoritarian, very conflicting people, or very conflict prone people, then people are going to they're going to have an advantage in the public sphere. I think it gets very complicated because they're authoritarian, but the authority subversion, as he was conceptualizing it in the book, is more to do with social hierarchies, right? And so in that regard, even the far left, the authoritarian left, still would fall. It's hard to say where they'd fall on that, because they're still trying to subvert social hierarchies. But I think it's arguable that that some of them are trying to invert social hierarchies rather than subvert them. And then you get into this complicated ground where you're trying to define someone else's intent differently to how they define it, which is fairly easy to do, because, you know, how do you assess what someone believes and what their intentions are? And I would argue that the most effective way to do that is to look at their actions and their consequences over a period of time. And if their actions and their consequences are authoritarian in nature over a expanse of time, then the fact that they're saying they're subversive is easily disprovable. But you do get it. It still falls into this difficult ground at times, because there's a question of degree on both sides, isn't there? And I feel that this is where it gets complicated when you try and homogenize them, because I think that there are a majority who are passive, maybe somewhat compliant, and actually you could argue that they are in that way respecting a social hierarchy, although it's a social hierarchy based on power, but because the passive and compliant ones are adhering to the doctrines of the most vocal and most authoritarian. But I would probably, yeah, I'm getting myself in a bit of a tangle here, because I'm just thinking about it. I'm like, those people who are more submissive and compliant towards the extreme end of the spectrum, where they're more authoritarian, probably would not consider themselves to be particularly respectful of authority or adhering to authority. Yeah, like, I'm not particularly good at respecting authority. I have a rebellious streak in me that tends to get me into trouble with people. I tend to try and be quite egalitarian, although I respect hierarchies based on merit. Basically, you know, if someone's competent and clearly capable and I trust them, then I'm more than happy to follow them until I think they're doing something that's morally wrong. But yeah, so I think I can see how the evolved emotions and instincts towards the authority subversion dimension that he's proposing manifest themselves within the left. And I guess this is the issue with self-report, because all of his research is done on self-report. And I think you would get a very different outcome if it was based on observation, but then you run into the issue of the conflict between self-report and observation. You can't really resolve that conflict, can you? Because observation is inherently prone to bias. I mean, I guess you could do this is sort of what Bjorn Lomborg did with the economic analysis of the environmental issues, right? He basically says economists tend to all come up with different figures for everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to get 100 economists, split them into teams, make them all work it out between themselves, and then we'll take an average of what everyone decides. So you would need a large scale observation of people's behavior and a means of measuring and assessing these moral dimensions, and then take an average out between those to get anything approximating a understanding of how they manifest themselves. But that would be very interesting to do, if very difficult.
Well, one of the things I wish I could engage with what you said in a way that didn't go off on a slight tangent, but I guess I need to do it.
Tangenting is the name of the game.
One of the big problems in all of this is the difference between individual and group moral functioning. And we can talk about elephants and riders all day long, but the left and the right is not the same thing as a left-leaning person and a right-leaning person. The two things are completely different. One of them, the individual is a moral agent, and you can interact with the individual as a moral agent, and you can connect with them. I mean, there's very few people that will just kick you to the curb if you attempt to communicate with them honestly and respectfully, right? But at least that's been my experience.
Yeah.
But in a group, it's very different. And there was a movie called The Corporation that came out at some point in the late 90s or early 2000s. And it was basically talking about how corporations, so they're legally persons in the United States, at least. I mean, corporation means, embodiment, that it's like an embodiment of a group. But the thing is, the corporation acts like a crazy person because it doesn't have an amygdala, right? It doesn't have moral intuition at all. And the whole book, the whole movie, well, it was based on a book. It was talking about how corporations aren't persons because they behave in ways that we could say are insane. And, setting aside whatever political rhetoric I could make about that, I think it's true that group behavior is something completely different from individual behavior, that a group is something much more than a collection of individuals. And that's the problem that we're wrestling with. And I think that is connected to what you just said just now. And again, you can only communicate with individuals. I don't know how a group can communicate in any way that's not just insane.
Well, it used to be, and perhaps this is one of those, romanticized ideas of the past. But I don't think it is, because I think there's enough evidence suggesting that this isn't the case. But it used to be more common for people to communicate cross-party, cross-ideology between them. And I was actually watching the Queen's funeral last Monday, and sorry, not the Queen's funeral. I was watching there was some ceremony for the new king being sworn in although he's not had his coronation yet. But I'm not very well clued up on the exact how these processes work exactly. But in a room to see this process, you had John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Keir Starmer, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, and you had Liz Truss, but she was part of the ceremony, so she wasn't actually in this social environment. You had far more people, but I basically saw our last 7 or 8 prime ministers we've had in this country, both from Labour and Conservative, stood around talking with each other, and they were smiling, they were shaking hands, things were very amicable. Whereas, although there is probably much more that goes on behind the scenes that I don't see when you look at, say, Parliament, you have Labour on one side of the room, Conservative on the other side of the room, and they just shout across the room at each other, and they boo when the other team's speaking, and it's always all very childish in many ways. And I was thinking, how valuable is this process going to have been, that the opposing political parties have had the opportunity to spend time with each other, to humanize each other, to speak in this non-oppositional context. And the death of the Queen in and of itself, as tragic as it is, I was like, this is something that unifies many people on the left and on the right, behind a national identity, but it's not a national identity based on being British in a sort of ethnic sense. It's more of a sort of British in a, I don't know what the word is, but because America is much better at doing this, from my understanding. Once you're here, you're an American, as long as you're adhering to the culture. Once you're there, sorry, I'm not in America. Once you're there, if you're striving to, better yourself and to live the American dream and all that, and adhering to the culture, then you're an American for all intents and purposes, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of where you came from. Whereas we tend to have more of a multiculturalism in the UK, with all its flaws, where you have these different enclaves of different cultures that aren't necessarily cohesive with one another, living side by side, and the conflicts that arise from that. And I've always thought, then, from reading the social psychology research, that clearly indicates the more you emphasize those differences, the more conflict and less cohesion there's going to be. I was like, well, what is the unifying identity that can transcend that? And the death of the Queen felt like it could be one of those moments to me, because regardless of where you were from, there are plenty of Indian people I've spoken to who are very upset and wanted to mourn. There are plenty of people from Asia, there are plenty of people from Africa, and then there's a small number of white people from Britain complaining about her role in colonization, which is a historical understanding of the situation, given that she was coronated at the end of the British Empire and we only oversaw its dismantling. But these are people, while you had these people complaining about the colonization impact, these were people from the colonies who the people complaining are claiming to represent, and they were very upset by the death of the Queen. I was like, this is a unifying thing, across the nation, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of culture. For the large part, everyone is unified in this national identity of, we are part of Britain as a country, as a community, and one of the symbols of Britishness has passed, and this marks a big change. And I was like, could this be one of those unifying moments that enables more conversation and mutually respectful dialogue between opposing ideologies within society? And maybe that's just me being romantic and optimistic, but it felt like it had that potential. Everyone will be at each other's throats again in a few days, I'm sure, but
Yeah, kind of like, well, never mind. I was gonna say 9/11 was unifying in the United States, but it was also uglifying. So I don't want to compare the two things at all, but it just reminded me.
well, Haidt spoke about that in the book, didn't he?
Did
was
he?
It, was it this book, or was it one of his other ones? Sorry, I've read 3 of his books in the last year. So
It might have been one of the other ones. I don't remember that but it might have been this one, and I just forgot.
No, it was this one, because I remember there's a chapter where he's got pictures of bumper stickers, and he was basically saying in the wake of 9/11 he felt this real compulsion to go and get an American flag and put it on his car.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, exactly. Yeah. There was a newfound willingness on the part of left-wing people to adopt a self-concept of being an American, because up until that time, the left didn't want to consider ourselves Americans. We wanted to consider ourselves sort of anti-American in a way, or like anti-authoritarian American government kind of thing, like pro-planet, pro-globe, anti-nationalist. Yeah. But that was like this little like first green leaves of patriotism kind of coming up, and then withering like after a year or two. We've been talking for a long time. And man, there's so much more to talk about, but
well, there always is. And the best thing for people to do is to read the book themselves. We're not going to ever be able to summarize. I mean, it's about, I remember we had a discrepancy in how many pages were in our books, because you've got your copy's a bit different to mine, but it's about 350 pages, so we're not going to do justice to all of it. And my idea with all of this is just that we converse on it, see what conversations it inspires and what directions it takes us, and then people can decide for themselves whether they want to go and delve into the book in its intricacies themselves. But yeah, anyway, we've got plans to talk about one of his other books in the future, so I'm sure that this one will get referenced again.
I don't want to leave without saying some key words of what I would like to see.
Okay.
Not necessarily from our discussion, but just from either Jonathan Haidt or the world in general. I would like to see his or I would like to see evolutionary psychology address moral courage, just in general. And I would like to see Jonathan Haidt specifically address moral courage. And I would like to see such a group of people also start to study how morality is developed within individuals, and how people's riders and elephants talk to each other. And also I wonder if it all just comes down to, again, person to person interaction. I wonder if there's any way of having reasonable, large scale conversations. I'm not sure that such a thing is possible.
Yeah, I tend to be up to thinking that everything starts with the individual, and if we get really good at having one-to-one conversations, then maybe we get better at talking to groups. And then if more of us get better at having one-to-one conversations and more of us get better at talking to groups, then more of us are able to form groups to talk to groups. And it's step by step. Keep on having the conversations, keep the dialogue open, and trying to humanize one another and understand each other's perspectives without becoming dogmatic and judgmental, and just keeping that open. And I think that we can achieve great things if we just keep following that step by step.
Yeah, and I also want to say too that it really doesn't have to do with manipulating. It doesn't have to do with manipulation at all, like emotional manipulation or rhetorical, keywords to get people to engage their elephants. Like, it's not about that. It's like, if you really are going to be an elephant whisperer, you need to connect with the elephant, period. Like, the goal, like that guy, the real elephant whisperer, he wasn't trying to manipulate elephants. He was trying to understand them.
Yeah.
So that's always has to be the number one goal. And I know that you believe that. Like, you want to connect with people where they are. You want to learn from them. You don't want to change them necessarily. Like, you want to have an effect on them, because that's what we want with our interactions, right? We want to affect other people, but we don't have these like preconceived notions.
Yeah. If I can help them on their journey to realize their potential, that's sort of what I'm aiming for.
Cool.
Right. That was good fun.
Yeah. That was